You are about to spend real money on hardware to run a large model at home, and the internet is full of people telling you what to buy. This is the guide I wanted before I started reading. By the end, you will know whether you need a cluster at all, which numbers decide it, what the options cost, and the traps that eat the budget. And I am going to do this backwards from how these videos usually go. The recommendations come first, in the next 2 minutes, so that if you only have 2 minutes, you still leave with the answer. Then we spend the rest of the episode on why, because a recommendation you cannot check is just somebody's opinion, and the prices behind it go stale within months. One thing before we start, because it should change how you listen to everything after it. I own none of this hardware. No 4-machine cluster, no Thunderbolt mesh, no rack. Everything on screen with a source card is somebody else's measurement, reported as theirs. Everything without one is arithmetic, and arithmetic you can redo on paper while you watch. Here is the single result that should make you slow down. Somebody put 4 identical machines on a desk and ran the same model twice. One arrangement gave him 15.2 tokens a second. The other one gave him 31.9 on that very same hardware. Same boxes, same model, same cables. Only the software choice changed. So what you buy is at most half of this decision, and the shopping lists that ignore the other half are the expensive kind. So here they are, with no build-up. Find the row that sounds like you. If you own one graphics card, the next thing you buy is a second card in that same machine, not a second machine. If you want one quiet purchase that runs very large models, the Big Apple desktop reads memory about 3 times faster than anything else here. If you genuinely intend to cluster, 2 of the small NVIDIA developer boxes are the only pairing in this price range with a measured payoff. If you want an enormous model cheaply and quietly, 4 small Apple desktops pool, 192 gigabytes on about 200 watts. If you are serving several people, buy cards and run separate models rather than splitting one. And if you use this occasionally, rent and stop reading buying guides. And the other half of a recommendation, which most guides leave out. I would not buy a third graphics card, because the fast splitting method divides attention heads, and those almost never divide by 3, so the tool refuses to start. I would not buy the newest gaming flagship for this job. I would not buy old data center cards below the software's version floor, however good the price per gigabyte looks. And I would not buy any machine for a port speed that nobody has published a real measurement of. That is the whole answer. Everything from here is why, and it matters more than the list, because every price in that table will be wrong within months, while the reasoning stays true. We will go in the order you actually have to decide. Whether to cluster at all. The 3 numbers that settle it. The one property of your model that flips the recommendation. Then the options priced, the traps, and a way to test your own shopping list before you pay. So let us start where the money is actually saved, which is the question most buying guides skipped entirely. For most people reading about clusters, the right move is one bigger box. Not because clustering is fake, but because a cluster only pays you back under conditions that are narrower than they look. A single machine has no network in the middle of the model. Nothing to tune, nothing to debug at 2 in the morning, and every part of the model can talk to every other part at the speed of memory instead of the speed of a cable. 3 questions settle this, and you can answer all of them today without buying anything. Does the model fit in the memory of one machine you could plausibly afford? Is the model sparse or dense, which we will get to, because it changes everything? And do you need one answer fast, or many answers at once? Those 3 send you down completely different roads. To be fair to the other side, there are real cases. If the model simply cannot fit in any single machine you can afford, a cluster is the only door. If you already own several machines, borrowing their memory is close to free. And if you are serving many requests at once rather than chasing one fast reply, extra machines add up honestly, because each one can be working on a different request. Now the arithmetic. 3 numbers, and between them, they rule out most of the internet's advice. Every honest decision here comes down to 3 quantities. How much fast memory you have, which decides whether the thing runs at all, how fast that memory can be read, which decides how quickly it answers, and how long a message takes to cross between machines, which decides whether splitting the model can ever be fast. Capacity, bandwidth, latency. Almost every disappointed cluster owner got one of those three wrong. Here is the division that does most of the work. To write one word, the machine has to read a certain number of bytes out of memory. So the speed you get is roughly your memory bandwidth divided by the bytes needed per word. That is it. It is not a law of physics so much as bookkeeping, but it lands close enough that you can use it to reject a purchase before you make it. This is also why the fastest chip is not automatically the right buy. Reading the model is the slow part, not the multiplying. A processor that can multiply twice as fast, attached to the same memory, mostly waits twice as politely. That single idea explains why a laptop chip with fast memory can embarrass a much stronger chip with slow memory, and it is the reason memory bandwidth is the number to look up first. Now the single property that changes the recommendation more than any piece of hardware in this episode. Models come in two shapes. A dense model uses all of its weights for every word it writes. A sparse one, the kind people label mixture of experts, keeps just as many weights on disk, but only wakes a small part of itself for each word. On the shop page, they look comparable. In the division we just wrote, they are not remotely the same thing, because the bytes per word differ by a factor of 8 or more. And here is the one measurement in this episode that is mine. Same laptop, same 8 GB of graphics memory, two models of roughly comparable size. The sparse one needs about 1 7/10 GB per word and runs at 53.8. The dense one needs 13.5 and runs at 7.8. Nearly 7 times the speed from the same machine, because of a property of the model rather than anything I bought. So the advice splits cleanly. If you are running sparse models, a cluster is genuinely worth considering, because each machine only has to move a small amount of data per word, and the network has a chance of keeping up. If you are running dense models, you want everything in one place, with the fastest memory you can afford, and spreading it across a network is close to the worst thing you can do to it. If you are still here, you are considering more than one device. There are two ways to divide a model, and they buy very different things. The first way is to cut the model into slabs and give each machine a slab. Machine 1 does the first quarter and hands the result to machine 2, and so on. Watch what the others are doing while one works. They are waiting. The word still has to walk through every machine in turn, so the time per word is the sum, not the average. This is the thing to understand before you spend, and it is the single most common disappointment. Cutting a model into slabs lets you run something that would not otherwise fit. It does not make it faster. 4 machines in a row is still one word walking through 4 machines. You bought memory, and memory is a real thing to buy, but if you expected 4 times the speed, you will be unhappy. The second way cuts the model the other direction. Every machine holds a thin slice of every layer, and they all work on the same word at the same time. That genuinely divides the work. But look at what it costs. At every layer, they must stop and combine their partial answers, and that is a conversation, not a handoff. Now count those conversations, because that is where the money goes. A large model can be 94 layers deep, and this method needs to combine partial answers roughly twice per layer. That is around 188 little round trips for every single word. If each round trip takes 300 microseconds on ordinary networking, you have spent 56 milliseconds per word on talking. On a fast at under 50 microseconds, the same conversation costs about 9. Nothing changed but the wire. If you take one practical note from this chapter, take this table. The default mode is safe and gives you capacity. The row mode is deprecated, and you will still find guides recommending it, which is a good reminder of how fast this ages. Tensor mode is the current answer for speed and is still marked experimental. And the fastest option of all remains not splitting at all, when the thing fits. And notice where tensor splitting shines. These are cards inside a single computer, where the gap between them is measured in microseconds because they share a motherboard. 47% on one model, 90% on another. That is the same technique that struggles across a room, working well across a few centimeters, which points at the recommendation for most people. So here is the shape of it. Several cards in one computer is the arrangement where the fast method actually works, because the distance is short. Several computers in a room is where it starts to struggle, unless you have gone out of your way to buy an unusual network. That is why my honest recommendation for most people is the second card before the second machine. If you are still going to connect machines, this is the chapter that decides whether it works, and it is the one people shop for wrongly. Here is the ladder everything sits on. Inside a graphics card, memory runs at hundreds of gigabytes a second. Between cards in a box, tens. Between machines on a good network, a few. And every step down that ladder is not just narrower, it is further away in time, which is the part the marketing never puts on the box. This is the distinction worth holding on to. Bandwidth is how much you can send, and it is what the cable is sold on. Latency is how long before the first byte arrives, and it is what those 188 round trips per word are actually paying for. Buying a cable with a bigger number will not help if the delay per message stays the same, and for most consumer links, it does. And this is what you should look at before buying a cable or a machine for its ports. Every row is a port sold on one number and measured at a very different one. The same standard, 40 gigabits on the label, delivered 9 on one machine and 27 on another. That is not a small variation. That is the difference between a cluster that works and one that sits in a cupboard. So here is the check. Do not ask what the port is rated at. Ask whether anyone has published a real measurement on the specific machine you are buying. Ask for the delay per message in microseconds and not just the throughput. And treat any claim of a special fast protocol with suspicion until you see the latency. One of the rows on that table calls itself the fast protocol and delivers 65 microseconds, which is a shim rather than the real thing. And I want to be concrete rather than leave you with a warning, because this test does have a winner you can actually purchase. Almost every consumer machine fails it, with ports advertised at 40 gigabits delivering 9. One class of machine passes it, and it passes because somebody soldered a proper 200 gigabit network card onto the board and shipped the collective software with it. When we get to the shopping chapter, that single difference is going to reorganize the recommendation for anyone who genuinely intends to cluster. Now the shopping. Everything from here has a source card, and every price is stamped July 2026. Before the numbers, a look at what we are actually choosing between. 4 shapes of machine. A tower stuffed with graphics cards, a small aluminium box you could hold in one hand, a compact developer machine built to be paired with another, and a wide workstation board with room for lanes. Every option in this chapter is one of those 4, and the shape tells you most of what it will be like to live with. A word on how to use what follows. Prices in this hobby move fast enough that any table is a snapshot rather than a fact, so treat the shape as the lesson and check the current number yourself. What will not change as quickly is the ranking and the reasons behind it. The used 24 gigabyte card is the backbone of most home builds, and its price has been on a ride. $500 to $700 privately at the end of last year, up to $1,300 to $1,500 at the peak this June, and now roughly 22% off that peak. The gap between a private sale and an auction site is consistently a couple of $100, which is worth the patience. Against the new generation, the comparison is less obvious than the spec sheet suggests. The newer card has more memory and nearly twice the bandwidth, which by our division means nearly twice the speed. It also draws 575 watts, costs 3 to 4 times as much on the street, and quietly dropped the direct card to card link the older one had. For a machine that will hold several cards, that missing link matters. This is the table I would pin above the desk. 1 card is easy, and any computer takes it. 2 cards is the sweet spot, and I mean that seriously. 48 gigabytes of fast memory, tensor splitting works properly, an ordinary board and a 1000-watt supply handle it, and you need no risers or frames. 3 cards is the one to avoid, and we will come back to why. 4 and 8 are real, but they stop being a computer and start being an installation. And this is the object most of that money is going to buy, so it is worth looking at properly. A big triple fan card, and underneath the cooler, the part that matters for a used purchase. The square processor in the middle, the ring of memory chips around it, and the soft pads that carry heat away from those memory chips. Those pads age, those memory chips are what die, and the standard tool will not show you their temperature. So let us build the machine people write in about, which is a big AMD workstation processor with 4 used cards in it. It is the most capable thing in this episode that still lives in one box, and the reason you reach for that particular processor is not speed, it is lanes. Every graphics card wants 16 lanes of the connection to the processor. An ordinary desktop board runs out after about 2 cards, and this is the family that does not. And this is what 4 cards actually looks like when you build it. A workstation board with a big socket in the middle and rows of memory either side. The cards spaced out on an open frame rather than crammed in a case, with riser cables reaching down to the board. And a power supply the size of a small brick, because this is the part people underestimate. And these are the numbers that decide whether it is possible in your house. Note the 3rd row, because I understated this earlier. The reference figure for these cards is 350 watts, but the versions actually sold pull 380 to 420, sustained and spike toward 464. So budget 400 a card. A 4-card machine wants a 2000 watt supply, which is more than a British kettle and more than many rooms will give you. And then look at the last row, because power limiting takes the graphics draw from about 1600 watts down to about 880. And here is the whole argument of this episode, on graphics cards instead of on machines. With the default splitting, going from 2 cards to 4 took a 70 billion model from 16.5 tokens a second to 17. You doubled the hardware and bought essentially nothing, because slabs buy capacity and not speed. Switch to real tensor splitting and it works. And look at the last 2 rows, which are the argument for stopping at 2. The direct card-to-card link is worth about 48% on a pair, and only about 9% once you have 4. Which is the honest summary of this whole build. 4 cards is real, it gives you 96 gigabytes, and if you are serving several people at once, those 353 batched tokens a second are excellent. But it needs a special processor for the lanes, a 2000 watt supply or careful power limiting, a frame instead of a case, and the pairing link that helps most has mostly stopped helping by the time you get there. 2 cards gives you half the memory for a quarter of the trouble. And I owe you a sharper version of something I said earlier. I told you to avoid 3 cards, and the reason matters more than the rule. It is not that 3 cards cannot work. It is that the fast splitting method divides the model's attention heads between the cards, and those head counts are almost always divisible by 2, 4 or 8, and almost never by 3. So the tool refuses to start rather than running slowly. Some engines are more flexible, and the scaling penalty by itself is mild. Check your specific model and engine before you assume either way. And a warning about the cheap end, because this is where people get hurt. Old data center cards look like a bargain per gigabyte, and some of them are dead ends. The line to check is a version number the software requires, and the older cards fall below it. That means the modern serving tools simply refuse to run, and no discount fixes software that will not start. 24 gigabytes at 19% of the speed is not a bargain. If you would rather buy a finished machine than build one, this is the field, and notice what has happened to it. Every one of these is well above its launch price, one of them by more than double. Memory-rich small machines became popular for exactly the reason this episode is about, and the prices moved accordingly. If you read a review quoting the launch price, that review is out of date. And here is why 2 people can compare the same machines and disagree completely. Rank them by dollars per gigabyte and one machine wins. Rank them by dollars per unit of memory speed and a different one does. Neither person is lying. They are optimizing for different halves of our earlier pair. Capacity against bandwidth, and which one you should care about depends entirely on the answers you gave in Chapter 1. And this is the whole difference between the two machines we are about to compare, in one picture. Two boxes and one thick cable, running straight between them, with no switch in the middle. Look at the port it plugs into, and then at the two cables side by side. One of them is an ordinary consumer connector, and the other is a proper high-speed network link. Everything in this chapter comes down to which of those two your machine has on the back. And now the comparison that matters most, if clustering, is actually your plan, because this is where the two popular memory-rich boxes stop being interchangeable. On their own, they are close enough that you could pick either. The moment you connect two of them, they are not in the same category, and almost nothing on the spec sheet tells you that. Look at the top two rows and then the bottom three. On memory bandwidth, they are within 7%, and on generating text, they are within about 15%, which is close enough that price should decide. Then look at the link. One has a 200 gigabit network card doing real remote memory access. The other has a port measured at 9 to 11 gigabits and a software imitation of the fast protocol. That is roughly 20 times the link, and it is the difference between the two ways of splitting a model from Chapter 4 actually being available to you. The prompt processing row is the other 5-to-1 gap, and you feel that on long documents. And one correction worth making, because you will hear it repeated everywhere, including by people who own these. The reason two of these cluster well is not the famous chip-to-chip link. That link is inside the machine, joining its processor to its graphics part. What joins two machines is an ordinary-looking network card running at 200 gigabits with remote memory access, on a single cable, with no switch. The distinction matters when you shop, because you are buying a network card and a software stack, not a magic bus. And this is the table that settles the clustering question, because it is the one I nearly shipped without. Two of these machines on that 200 gigabit link took a 120 billion parameter model at full precision from about 75 tokens a second to 120. Roughly 1.6 times from adding one machine. Now put that against the Mac cluster in the row below, which got 1.56 times from adding 3 machines. That is the fabric argument paying off in tokens instead of in specifications, and it is the strongest of clustering in this episode. And the honest ceiling on that, which is the last row. Two of these machines share 256 gigabytes, and that is comfortable for a model of 120 billion parameters. Push past it to the really enormous models, and you are into aggressive 1-bit compression, and somebody who tried exactly that reported the generation was tolerable while reading the prompt became unusable. So the pair is excellent up to its memory, and the memory is the real limit, rather than the wire. Now the option I have been circling without naming, because on our central division it beats everything else in this chapter. The large Apple desktop reads its memory at about 819 gigabytes a second. That is 3 times the two memory-rich boxes we just compared. Put that into tokens per second equals bandwidth divided by bytes per word, and for writing text it is not close. It also has the most unified memory you can buy in one piece without moving to a server. And 2 caveats, because this is exactly where buying guides cheat. You will see the Apple machine quoted at 88 tokens a second, and the other boxes in the 30s, and that is not a fair fight. The high figure is a 7 billion parameter model, and the other numbers are 120 billion. Compare only within a benchmark. The second caveat is the price. The figure I put on the table is the entry configuration, and the very large memory version that makes this machine interesting costs roughly double that. But here is the bill for that, and it is the reason I did not simply tell you to buy one. Reading your prompt is a different job from writing the answer, and it leans on raw computing rather than memory speed. On that job, the Apple machine sits near the bottom of this table, about 8 times behind a strong graphics card. For short chatty prompts you will never notice. Feed it a long document or a big pile of code, and you will wait through every one of those seconds before the first word appears. which gives a clean rule. If your work is conversational, if you want very large models answering at a comfortable pace, and if quiet and low power matter in the room you sit in, it is the strongest single machine here. If you feed it long documents all day, or you need the training and serving tools that only exist properly on the other ecosystem, you are buying the wrong strength. And it is worth saying plainly that almost everything outside inference assumes you are on the other stack. And this is the cluster from the opening, in full. Look at the first two rows together, because they are the whole argument. The same 4 machines, the same model. With the popular tool over ordinary networking, 4 machines produced less than 1 machine did. With a different stack over a fast link, they produced 31.9. The bottom 2 rows are the honest case for clustering, models of 600 billion and a trillion parameters running at all. And here is the arrangement people actually build when they want a lot of memory quietly. 4 small aluminium boxes on a shelf, joined by short cables through 1 port on the back of each. No frame, no risers, no special circuit. The entire stack draws less power than 1 big graphics card, and between them, they hold more memory than the tower we just built. And the option people actually buy that I nearly left out, because the small Apple desktop turns out to be the cheapest honest way into clustering. 4 of them pool 192 gigabytes for somewhere around $7,000. Look at the second row though, because that is the one that surprised me. The entire 4-machine cluster draws about 200 watts under full load, which is less than a single top-end graphics card pulls on its own. And it will run a 671 billion parameter model at 5.37 tokens a second, which nobody would call fast, but the alternative on most desks is that it does not run at all. So be clear about what that buys. It is not speed. The bigger Apple machines in the row above are about 6 times quicker on the same giant model, because each one reads memory 3 times faster. What the small cluster buys is capacity per dollar, and it buys it quietly and on an ordinary wall socket. If your goal is to have an enormous model in the house at all, on a budget, in a room you sit in, that is a real answer. If your goal is a quick reply, it is the wrong shape. And the last shape, which is a machine with no graphics cards in it at all. A big square processor, and around it the thing that actually matters for this job, which is the banks of memory slots. Notice on the 2-socket board that each processor has its own separate bank. That physical separation is the whole reason the next result surprises people. One more option people ask about, which is a big server board with 2 processors instead of graphics cards at all. It sounds like it should double everything. Watch what happens when a piece of the model lives in the memory attached to the other processor. Getting at it means crossing between them, and that crossing is measurably slower than reaching your own memory. And the measurements are blunt. Adding a whole second processor bought between 2 and 8% on generating text with a large sparse model, and on one machine it was actually negative. The same second socket gave over 80% more on a dense model, and helped substantially on reading the prompt. So it is not that the second socket does nothing. It is that it does nothing for the specific job most people are buying it for. If you do go down the processor road, this is the number to shop on. Memory channels and their speed, not socket count and not core count. Notice the last row. A previous generation server processor with older memory measured slower than a small desktop machine, which is the kind of result that saves you from a listing that looks impressive. Now the part I would most want a friend to tell me before I spent anything. These are the things that quietly eat the budget. Start with the cheapest trap to avoid. This is 1 card, in 1 month, priced by 9 different published guides. The spread is roughly 75% from the bottom to the top. If you read one article and take its number as the market rate, you can overpay by hundreds without ever knowing. Check several sources on the day you buy, and prefer completed sales over asking prices. On used cards, which is where most of this money goes. Ask whether it was used for mining and for how long. Ask for a photo of the card running under load with the temperatures visible. budget for replacing the thermal pads, because on these cards the memory runs hot and the pads age. And be aware that the standard monitoring tool does not show you the memory temperature, which is exactly the one that kills these cards, so you need a separate utility to read it. Now the 3-card trap, which is worth a moment because it is so unintuitive. The fast splitting method wants to divide the work into equal halves, then halves again. With 2 or 4 cards that lands evenly. With 3, it cannot, so you fall back to the slow method, and your 3rd card mostly adds capacity you are paying to keep warm. Then the physical traps, which do not appear in any benchmark. Several of these cards at full draw will trip a normal household circuit, which is why serious builds either get their own supply or run the cards power limited. Cards are 3 slots wide, so a board with enough spacing matters as much as the board's specification. And a build with 4 cards stops fitting in a case and becomes an open frame on a shelf, which is a different thing to live with. And the good news inside that problem. Someone swept the power limit on one of these cards and found that dropping it from 350 watts to 300 actually ran slightly faster, and that 250 cost about 1%. The collapse only comes at 200. So you can run several cards on a sane circuit for almost no performance, which quietly makes the 4-card build possible in an ordinary house. And 3 software traps, because the hardware is only half of it. The first will have your first server quietly swallow the whole memory pool unless you turn a flag off. The second is a broken memory probe on one popular machine, where the software reads the wrong pool entirely, and you have to place things by hand. The third catches everyone, which is that the friendliest tool cannot pin a model to a chosen card, and that is not a setting you have failed to find. And one idea that is worth more than most of the hardware in this episode. If you have 2 devices, the instinct is to split one model across them. Consider instead running a whole model on each. No network in the middle, no splitting, and both devices busy on different work. And the measurements back it strongly. The same 4 cards, matched on power, produced between 2 and 3.5 times more total work as 4 separate copies than as one split model. If your job is serving several people or running things in the background, this is probably your answer, and it needs no special network at all. The caveat is that these are copies of the same model, so it helps throughput rather than making one reply faster. Everything so far was somebody else's machine. This chapter is about your plan, and it costs nothing to run. So I wrote the arithmetic down as a small tool, because doing it by hand is where mistakes creep in. You give it the size of the model, the memory bandwidth of the machine you are considering, and if you are clustering, the speed and delay of the link. It gives you the ceiling. Let me run it here, and this output is real, on the laptop I actually own. Read it as a ceiling rather than a promise. If the tool says you will get around 50 and the reviews say 60, fine, you are in the right neighborhood and the difference is detail. If the tool says 4 and you were hoping for 40, no amount of tuning is going to rescue that, and you have just saved the price of the hardware by typing one command instead of buying it. And here is the honest test of the tool. I gave it the cluster from earlier, a model of 235 billion parameters, with about 1/10 awake per word, 4 machines, and the link they used. Then I compared its answer against what that person actually measured on hardware I have never touched. It lands in the right region on both arrangements, which is all I want from a tool you run before you spend. One more cost that the shopping lists leave out, and it can be larger than the hardware. A 4-card machine pulling about 1 2/10 kilowatts around the clock costs $88 a month where I am, and $386 in Germany. Over 3 years that difference is larger than the machine. This is why the same build genuinely is a good idea in one country and a poor one in another, and why you should put your own rate into this before deciding. And the comparison nobody selling hardware wants to make. Renting the same card is about 22 cents an hour. If you use a machine 2 hours a day, renting costs you something like $13 a month. And buying does not catch up for years. The case for owning is real, but it is about privacy, about constant availability, and about learning the stack. It is usually not about saving money, and anyone telling you otherwise has not done this division. So be honest with yourself about which reason applies. Owning wins when the data cannot leave your building, when you want the thing available without thinking about a meter, when you are running it hard enough for the arithmetic to turn, or when the learning is the point. Those are all good reasons. Saving money on light use is not one of them. And if you take one rule from this whole episode, maybe take this one, because it protects you from every mistake in the traps chapter at once. Rent first. Use the rented machine for a month, doing the work you actually intend to do rather than the work you imagine. Then look at the bill. When your monthly rental starts to look like a payment on the hardware, buy the hardware, and buy it knowing your real usage instead of guessing at it. Almost nobody does this, and it is the cheapest month you will ever spend on this hobby. One last thing that almost no guide written elsewhere will tell you, and it matters more than most of the hardware in this episode. Go back to that electricity table. The same machine cost $88 a month to run where I am, and $386 in Germany. That is not a detail, that is the whole verdict flipping. In a cheap power country, owning wins far earlier than the internet's advice suggests, because most of that advice is written where power is expensive. Put your own rate into the arithmetic before you believe anybody, including me. So back to the table we opened with. Same rows, except now you can argue with every one of them. If you own a machine with one card, the next thing to buy is a second card in that same machine, not a second machine. If you want one purchase that runs large sparse models with no assembly, a memory-rich single box is the calm choice, and you should shop it on measured bandwidth rather than on the size of the memory. If you are serving several people, buy cards and run separate copies. And if you already own several machines, try clustering with what you have before buying anything at all. Now the tier this guide would be dishonest to leave out, because so far I have been optimizing for the smallest sensible spend. If you know that you want two machines working as one, then stop shopping on memory size and buy the machine with a real network card in it. You are not paying for a faster box. On its own, it is barely ahead. You are paying for the only fabric in this price range that makes the fast kind of splitting possible at all, plus a software stack where the collective operations are somebody else's problem instead of yours. And the third tier, which suits more people than the internet admits. If what you actually do is hold conversations with a very large model, and you would rather buy one quiet machine than build anything, the Big Apple desktop reads memory about 3 times faster than either of the boxes we compared, and that is the number that sets how fast the words come out. You give up prompt processing speed, and you give up most of the training ecosystem. For a lot of people, neither of those is what they were going to do anyway. With a cheaper variant of the same thought, which is the one I would point most people at if they want an enormous model in the house, without an enormous bill. 4 of the small Apple desktops pool 192 gigabytes for around $7,000, draw about 200 watts between them, and sit on a shelf making no noise. You are trading speed for capacity and for a quiet room. On a giant model, it is roughly 6 times slower than the expensive version, and it still runs the thing. But hold the other side of it too, because the cheaper box is not a trap. If you are honest that you will only ever run one machine, it costs several $100s less. It generates text within about 15% of the more expensive one, and you can put whichever operating system you like on it. Everything the expensive machine wins on is either clustering or long prompts. If neither of those is your life, you would be buying a network card you never plug in. With one condition on that, and it is a sharp one. The cheaper box is only the sensible buy near the bottom of its price range. Near the top, at around $4,300, you are saving roughly $350 against the alternative and accepting prompt processing that is 5 times slower. That is not an abstract number. It is how long you wait every time you paste in a long document or point it at a folder of code. So take the cheapest version of that machine, or do not take it at all. And if you want the whole AMD question in a sentence, here it is. It is a good single machine, and it has no fast way to become two. Everything it does inside one box is competitive, and every route out of that box is the slowest measured in this episode. So buy it as a finished machine that you are content to keep as one machine, and never buy it as the first node of something you plan to grow. And the other side of the list. I would not buy a third card because of the splitting problem. I would not buy old data center cards that the current software refuses to run on, however good the price per gigabyte looks. I would not buy a second processor socket, hoping it doubles generation speed on a big sparse model. And I would not buy a machine for a port speed that nobody has published a real measurement for. And I want to name that last one directly, because it is the purchase I would most expect a viewer to make against their own interest. The newest flagship gaming card is genuinely fast, and it has the best memory bandwidth here. But for this job, it is beaten by two used cards that together cost less, hold more memory, and can split a model between them, which the new one can no longer do because the direct card-to-card link was removed. It also pulls 575 watts at the wall. It is a superb card being sold at a premium for a job it does not win. And the honest limits of this guide. I own none of this, so every cluster number came from someone else and I have reported it as theirs. Some current prices could not be confirmed, including the older data center cards. One machine's memory bandwidth is a manufacturer figure that I could not find measured anywhere. And prices in this hobby move fast enough that some of the numbers here will be wrong by the time you watch this. The method survives that. The prices will not. So the whole guide on one card. Does it fit in one box you can afford? And if it does, buy that and stop reading. Is the model sparse or dense? Because dense wants one machine and sparse gives a cluster a chance. Divide bandwidth by bytes per word to get your ceiling before you pay. Remember that slabs by capacity and slices by speed, and that slices need microseconds, which really means one box. 2 cards is the sweet spot, and 3 is the trap. And unless you are using it hard, rent it first. And the 5 commands this comes down to. First, the arithmetic, because it costs nothing and lands within about 20%. Second, a second card in the machine you already own, with the current split flag and not the deprecated one. Third, with 2 devices, run 2 models before you split one. Fourth, read what the clustering server says about itself, which is that it is a proof of concept, fragile and insecure, and should never run on an open network. And fifth, before you buy anything used, read the memory temperature the standard tool will not show you. And one last look at the picture that should stay with you while you shop. A single machine gave 20.4 tokens a second. 4 machines with the popular tool gave 15.2, which is 4 times the hardware buying a slower answer. 4 machines done properly gave 31.9 over the same wires. And the dense model across the same cluster gave 0.7, exactly what the arithmetic warned. The hardware was identical in all 4 rows. If this saved you a purchase, or talked you into the right one, subscribe and send it to whoever is about to buy the second machine. This has been CodeZen.